Good morning, brothers and sisters. Wanted to cut a little video this morning that's probably a little bit different than what I normally talk about because I feel it's very important in a lot of ways. I could actually even have a Christmas message if you think about it. No matter what your persuasion is, what your religious persuasion is, and so on, Christmas, if you think about it from the Christian perspective, here's the coming of a Messiah, a Savior, if you will, to enable the salvation of man. Now, there's a lot has been said about this word salvation. Do we really need saving and so on? Apparently the word salvation, if you go back far enough, it comes out of the word salt, if you will. And salt was seen as this element of great importance, this element of importance for sustaining life, if you will. Elementary to the substance of the ocean, and the ocean was very symbolic as to this resemblance of God, if you will, this infinite source. So, you could take it in today's terminology, the ability to wake up. This was a message that would enable people to wake up to what was possible to them. So that's another way of looking at the Christmas message, perhaps in a more modern sense. So here it is, Christmas Eve, 2013. And I want to make this message as positive as possible, but hopefully it is positive, but hopefully it's also something of value for everyone listening. Now, what's interesting is that whenever there has been a messenger, which from most historical accounts, Jesus certainly was, this messenger was not greeted with open arms, shall we say, by the ruling classes. And this has been exemplified down through the ages in horrendous terms, in many cases, violations of human dignity and so on by these ruling classes. And what it basically showed is that anybody throughout history who lives according to the dictates of their conscience rather than the dictates of the dictators ends up on the firing line, as in, or whatever the form of firing line was at that time, as in Jesus' case it was the cross eventually. But there are lots and lots and lots of examples, just obvious, a couple of obvious ones. Okay, Socrates, there was an example of somebody who lived his conscience and was forced by the ruling classes to condemn to death, essentially. And it doesn't necessarily have to be in the form of governments. It can be in religion. Religion is full of examples of barbarity, because religion takes the expression of a ruling class, no question about it. A good example is, you can Google this lady, Ayn Hirsi Ali, a Muslim woman turned atheist. Of course, that is a death sentence in that religion, as far as I know, by the perverts of that religion. And she had to go into hiding basically for indefinitely almost. And you can read her book. It's called The Infidel. It's very very enlightening as to what happens when one challenges the status quo of whatever society one is in and decides to live their conscience. Baha'u'llah, I think that's his name, I'm not sure, the originator of the Baha'i faith, was also persecuted heavily. I believe he spent about 40 years, most of his adult life in prison. And not because he harmed anybody, not because he murdered anybody or anything. This is not the case of these things. It's the same with Jesus. Jesus didn't go around murdering people, but he was hung on the cross because he dared to violate the authority, and not overtly, just by living his life, by the freedom of his conscience. That was enough to be a violation. How dare you actually live truth. You're supposed to live lies in that other world. And that's perfectly fine. Solomon Rushdie is a good example. Just for writing a fictionist tale, was basically given a death edict by a whole bunch of perverts who are in need of salvation, in need of enlightenment, you might say. The reason why these messengers come is for those poor souls. And actually, in the case of Jesus, in the story when he was being crucified, this shows the difference between enlightenment and the enslavement of so many people. Now, whatever you want to frame Jesus' words in is up to you. I'm not presenting any slant on a religion or anything here whatsoever. But he forgave. He asked for forgiveness for his captors because he saw them as enslaved in their own consciousness, if you will. Father, which was his word for the Abba, the infinite. Forgive them, for they know not what they do. It's like he was already knew that they didn't really know. They were living the lie, and they didn't even see the lie that they were living. And he felt sorry for them, even though he was being subjected to their swords and their spears. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. is another example. He was gunned down, and almost with a sense of it didn't matter anymore. The truth was more important to him. His sense of the truth was more important than to whatever spears or bullets they would throw against him. And most recently, we have the guy in South Africa, I forget his name right now, who was jailed for many, many years. And it's interesting actually how, you see politicians now marching out in support of this man's efforts to bring freedom to humanity. And yet, if you think about it, it was politicians who put this guy in jail. And it is these very politicians who, in their sleeping nature, to this very day, have thousands of people in jail for having harmed nobody, for perhaps possessing a plant that grows in nature, and there are people in jail for that. All sorts of things. In fact, I know of one individual, and it's what prompted me to speak out today, who is in jail being tortured at this moment because he's harmed nobody. At least there's no evidence of that. Nobody's presented anything that he's harmed anybody. He was captured shortly after doing a seminar in Toronto by 4, I believe, heavily armed unknown men who happened to have the word police written on their jackets, but I could go and get a jacket and have police written on it. No badges, no name tags, refuse to identify themselves to anybody. They're in unmarked cars. They have no warrant, present no warrant. They just grab him and run. And he's thrown into solitary confinement well over a month ago. They haven't been able to pin anything on him. They first of all told the public that this was going to be open hearings. Apparently about 30 of his supporters show up to the jail, or up to the courthouse, and they make it a closed court case. And only allow the media in, apparently, the authorized media. Of course, the authorized media is part of their system because they work by their statutes. The average individual man showing up, they don't know if they're going to operate by their statutes and therefore not follow their little internal rules. So they say it's public, but it's not. If they can close it, then it's not public, is it? It's private. So it's a private, organized group who have kidnapped a man and are trying to convince him to commit himself. Look, they wouldn't have to have a court case, would they, if they knew they had complete control over this man? They could just simply do whatever they want. But no, they have to get him they have to try to force him to commit himself, to confess himself that he is something, that he belongs to this organization and so on. I just want you to know that, because we think a lot of times that Nelson Mandela, sorry, I just snapped back at the guy from South Africa, Nelson Mandela. But I just wanted to tell you about this, not to harp on it or anything, but to show you the parallel that has gone on through history of people who would stand up and teach their fellow man what they felt was the truth. And because of that, they're persecuted and many times killed. And this is exactly the parallel that's happening here. If you don't think it's happening, you don't believe me, just do the research. You're going to find research on the other side. You're going to find mainstream media who will smear people and call them terrorists and so on. But if you really want to test it, see if you can find out where these people have actually harmed somebody. That's real criminality, is when somebody harms somebody. But if somebody accuses somebody else of doing something, that's not good enough, is it? That's not good enough to incarcerate somebody and torture somebody based on an accusation alone. No evidence. This has gone on since the dawn of humanity. It's always gone on. And government, or the source of the I'm going to use the word problem here, just because it's very convenient to use. The source of the problem throughout human history is us individually turning over our autonomy, if you will, to other men and women. And that autonomy has always been turned over to some form of government, whether it's been a church, whether it's been a teaching class, whether it's been a government, whether it's been of any kind of form, any kind of agarchy, or an archy, or an ism, or any of these sorts of ruling mechanisms. When we turn over our authority to administer our own affairs here on earth, we end up with atrocities. We end up with situations like this because we turn ourselves over to a system, and the system has, this is the way you have to behave. And as soon as we behave counter to that, we have examples, millions of them, throughout history. In the extreme examples, we see ruling classes like Hitler's outfit. You know, as some people say to me, Steve, yeah, but you got to obey the law. Oh, really? Really, what is the law? What people mean by the law normally is the legislated dictates of the ruling megalomaniac authorities, so-called authorities. Well, did you know that apparently in Hitler's Germany, it was against the law to harbor a Jew? Now, let me repeat that. It was against the law to harbor a Jew. Now, does that make it moral or right to follow that law? Of course it doesn't. And you might say, oh, Steve, yeah, but that's not what it's like here. Ah, yes, it is. There are many things that go on. For example, the simple thing, I'm not speaking in favor of it or anything like that. But no matter what you call it, you can call it God, you can call it nature, or whatever it is, provides plants and animals that nobody can claim to have created. Yet, there are government statutes that say you're not allowed to have a certain plant. Ridiculous, isn't it? Nature and God, or whatever you want to call it, has created this plant, but then somebody else will come along and say, yeah, but you're not allowed to have it. You can't have that, or else you got to have my license in order to it. You know what a license is? A license is the ability to do what is otherwise illegal. That's what a license is. And it's within that system. But before I go too deep into that, you take an outfit like Hitler, and the result of people turning over their power to outfits like that, this is an extreme example, but approximately 50 million people died because of faith in an outfit like this in the last 100 years. In that, whatever it was, 8-year period or whatever it was, that Hitler reigned, there was about 50 million people died. Not directly because of him, but arguably instigated through and of and so on, associated with that. Associated with our brothers and sisters of the past, turning over their authority and their autonomy to outfits like this. And once again, you might say, Steve, well, this is not what's going on here. This is not that extreme. My response to that would be, look, it doesn't really matter how much enslavement there is. If there's any enslavement at all, that's too much. I would agree with you that if a man has 100 slaves, I wouldn't agree with that. That's wrong. You have another man who only has 1 slave. Yes, that's an improvement. No question about it. Enslaving 1 individual instead of 100 individuals is definitely an improvement. But it doesn't make the enslavement of 1 individual right. You see, in my view anyway. So what I'm saying is any form of enslavement, any form of making somebody do something when it's not their conscience is incorrect. Now, voluntary enslavement, fine. But involuntary enslavement is incorrect. So if you have somebody show up at your house, knock on the door, or at your seminar, knock at the door, come in, not identify themselves, and with the power of their guns, take you away, lock you in a cage, without your consent, that is worse than enslavement. That is kidnapping. And of course, if you're locked away without your consent in solitary confinement, maximum security, that is torture by anybody's definition. That's what is going on today. That is what's going on in Canada right now. I want you to know that. Don't believe me necessarily, but do your research and think about that the next time you might want to be tempted to fill out one of those forms called an income tax form and voluntarily give your money over to an outfit that will do this to your brothers and sisters who are only, or potentially only anyways, living out the dictates of their conscience first, not the dictates of dictators. Also remember, and you can do your research if you want, some of the other things that your tax dollars go to, especially if you live in the United States, are in the purchasing of untold millions and millions and millions of rounds of hollow point ammunition. Now, Steve, you might be saying, what are you talking about on this Christmas Eve? Because it's directly translatable. Because there is salvation possible for us by waking up to what's going on. Because if we just listen to that and we listen to the media and they say, oh, that's just all for target practice or something like that. If you know anything about bullets, hollow point ammunition is not used for target practice. Hollow point ammunition is used for killing people, period. It's a bullet designed to go into your body and then explode and rip your insides apart. That's what these are bought for. And they're buying millions and millions and millions of rounds. Government agencies are. Government agencies that are supposed to, originally were intended to protect us. And now it appears that the government agencies are vacuums, you might say, where tyrants fill those vacuums in order to control whoever they can. And this is what's happening. This is the threat tactics. So to finish this up, I guess I'd say that history is full of examples of people who've said, I'm going to listen to my conscience, and I'm not going to listen to the lies of the dictates of others, because that's always what they are. If we won't live the voice within, the voice of reason from within, the conscience from within, if we won't listen to that, if we'll put it aside, then to that extent we are living a lie. My recommendation is, do your own research, but in the end, I think if you consciously and honestly have a look at what you're listening to, you will eventually stop listening to your politicians. You will stop listening to your media. You will stop listening to your teachers. And you will begin to listen to what's going on within yourself. What you feel is right. And you'll only listen to those others if parts of what they're saying actually resonates with what's resonating inside of you. When we stop listening to all the other nonsense that's going on out there, in spite of the threats and saber rattling that may be going on, we'll begin to listen to our conscience, or you might say listen to our hearts instead. And as a result, we will become peaceful warriors of truth. Merry Christmas, and may you have a wonderful and joyous New Year as well. Steve here signing off. Hope to see you in the new year. Bye-bye for now.